A cowboy lay bleeding in the snow with a broken leg 6 hours from dark and 60 head of cattle freezing to death in the hills around him. He had no horse, no help, no reason to believe anyone was coming. And then through the whiteout, he heard hoofbeats. This is the story of the woman who rode out of that blizzard and the 40 years that followed. The gray light of a winter dawn fell across the Thornton ranch like a wound that would not close. Hannah Thornton stood at the pasture gate with a Winchester rifle held across her chest, the barrel leveled at three riders approaching from the dirt road. Her honey-colored hair whipped loose in the wind, but her eyes did not blink. Behind her, 60 head of cattle grazed in the winter pasture, unaware that their lives and the life of the woman guarding them hung by a thread no thicker than a trigger pull. The lead rider stopped his horse 30 yards out. Cold sunlight caught the gold ring on his left hand as he turned it slowly on his finger. Patiently, the way a man turns something when he has learned that patience is the sharpest weapon there is. To his right sat Virgil Hatch, lean and sharp-featured, a former deputy with granite eyes, and a reputation that preceded him like a cold wind. To his left, a ranch hand whose name did not matter because, but in this moment, nothing mattered except the distance between the rifle barrel and the man who wore the ring. "Mrs. Thornton," Silas Garrett said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "I have come with a final offer, and this time I strongly suggest you listen." Hannah raised the rifle barrel half an inch, just enough for the steel to flash in Garrett's eyes. "Last man who rode onto this ranch uninvited," she said, her voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake, "had to find his own way home. You want to test your luck, Mr. Garrett. But to understand why a woman stood alone at a ranch gate with a rifle in her hands on a cold Nevada morning, we need to go back 11 months. Back to the day it all began. Back to the blizzard. This is the story of a cowboy frozen in his past and a woman the world tried to break for daring to live on her own terms. Before this story ends, you will watch them survive the worst blizzard in 30 years, face down the richest and most dangerous man in the valley, and find a way to tear down the walls they had each built around their own hearts. But none of it would have happened without one January night, a crippled leg, and 60 head of cattle running blind into a killing storm. January 1883. Winter in Nevada does not forgive. When the cattle broke through the fence and scattered into the hills, Caleb Thornton had exactly 6 hours before dark. After that, any animal still out in the open would freeze to death. And if he lost the herd, he lost the ranch. If he lost the ranch, he lost the last reason he had to keep breathing. But the real clock was bigger than that, and it would only reveal itself in time. To understand the man who would ride into that blizzard, you need to understand what the West had already taken from him and what it had given in return. Caleb Thornton was born in 1855 on a small farm outside Independence, Missouri. His father grew corn. His mother read to him by candlelight and told him stories about the wide-open West, where a man could build anything from nothing if he had the will in the hands. Caleb grew up with two things: a love of horses so deep it lived in his blood, and a younger brother named Ethan, who followed him everywhere like a second shadow. When Caleb was 17, a fever swept through Independence and took both his parents within a month of each other. He sold the farm to cover debts, bought 2 horses, 2 saddles, and 2 bedrolls, and took 14-year-old Ethan west. They joined a cattle drive on the Chisholm Trail, the legendary route that carried thousands of longhorns from Texas to Kansas every spring, and for 3 years they lived the cowboy life in its purest form, sleeping under stars, eating beans and hardtack, riding 16 hours a day through dust and rain and every kind of weather the plains could produce. The trail made Caleb into what he was. It taught him to read the sky and predict a storm 3 hours before it hit. It taught him to sing Cattle Calm at midnight when the herd was restless and a single gunshot or crack of thunder could send 400 animals into a blind stampede. It taught him that the only things a man truly owns are the skills in his hands and the promises he keeps. And it taught him loss, because on the third drive in 1877, the trail took Ethan. After that, Caleb left the trail and never went back. He drifted for a year, working ranches for wages, saving every cent, speaking to almost no one. In 1878, at the age of 23, he found a piece of land outside Stillwater, Nevada, bought it for nearly nothing, and began to build. 5 years of labor that would have killed a lesser man. Digging wells, stringing fence, building a house with his own hands, stone by stone, beam by beam. growing a herd from a handful of cows into 60 head of healthy stock. He hired Harlan Dawson, first recognizing in the older man a steadiness and competence that reminded him of the best cowman he had known on the trail. Levi Hollis came later, young and eager, the kind of hand who would learn fast if you had the patience to teach him. By January of 1883, Caleb Thornton had a ranch, a herd, two loyal hands, in a house that smelled of loneliness. He had built everything a man could build with his hands. But the one thing he could not build, the thing that required opening up rather than fencing in, remained forever beyond his reach. Or so he believed. The night before the storm, the small house of Caleb Thornton sat silent in the Nevada dark 3 miles north of the town of Stillwater. It was a house built by one man's hands, every beam cut and fitted by Caleb himself, every stone in the fireplace hauled from the creek bed, every nail driven straight, with the precision of a man who had learned on the Chisholm Trail that the things you build with your own labor are the only things worth having. The house smelled of wood smoke and leather and coffee gone cold on the stove, the scent of a life lived alone, maintained but not really inhabited. Inside, the low flicker of an oil lamp cast its light across a man sitting on the edge of his bed, tall, broad-shouldered, a dark beard trimmed close, calloused hands resting on his knees, hands that had held branding irons and lariat ropes and reins in every kind of weather the West could throw at a man. He was 28 years old, but his brown eyes carried the look of a man who had already seen more than any man should have to see. On the bedpost level with his eyes hung an old cowboy hat. It was smaller than Caleb's own. Sun-faded, the brim curled slightly from years of weather. It was the hat of an 18-year-old boy, a hat that no one would ever wear again. "Finish the east fence line today," Caleb said to the hat, his voice low and steady, as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. Harlan griped about digging post holes in rock, but when doesn't he gripe? He was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind press against the window glass. "Winter's colder this year than any I remember," he said. "Might be a storm coming. But the herd looks good, 60 head. You'd be proud if you could see them." Then softer, barely a whisper. "I miss you, Ethan." He turned down the lamp and lay back, in the dark eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The hat hung there on the bedpost, silent, the way it had hung there every night for 6 years. This was Caleb Thornton, cowboy, rancher, a man who had built a life from nothing with his own two hands, but could not rebuild the heart that had broken inside him. Somewhere behind his closed eyes a memory stirred. It came the way it always came, without warning, without mercy, the thunder of hooves, red dust thick enough to choke, the frantic bawling of 400 cattle running blind, and then the scream. A single scream that Caleb Thornton heard every night in his dreams, though 6 years had passed since the sound first tore through the air. The scream of an 18-year-old boy calling his brother's name. He opened his eyes in the dark. The hat on the bedpost said nothing. It never did. Morning came cold and bright on the 14th of January. In the barn, Harlan Dawson stood brushing down a horse with the slow, measured strokes of a man who had been doing this particular job for longer than most people had been alive. 57 years old, tall and thin as a fence post, with a face like a leather map of every trail he had ever ridden. He had fought at Shiloh and walked the Chisholm Trail and buried more friends than he cared to count. And through all of it, he had kept two things intact: his sense of humor and his loyalty, both of which he considered non-negotiable. Levi Hollis, 23 and perpetually curious, swept the barn floor beside him. "Hey, Harlan," Levi said, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man working up to a question he probably should not ask. "Why does the boss talk to himself every night? I can hear him through the wall." "Who's he talking to?" Harlan did not stop brushing. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Levi thought the old man had not heard. "His brother," Harlan said at last. "Ethan, lost on the Chisholm Trail 6 years back." The boss had a brother. He did, 4 years younger. After their folks died of fever in Missouri, Caleb took Ethan west with him. 2 brothers, 2 horses, and the whole world ahead of them. Harlan stopped brushing and looked out through the barn door to where Caleb was riding across the pasture on his gelding, checking the herd. A solitary figure against a gray sky, moving the way he always moved, alone. "What happened?" Levi asked, quieter now. Harlan shook his head. "Not my story to tell, but I'll say this much. Caleb Thornton is the best man I ever knew, and the loneliest. He built this ranch not for himself. He built it for Ethan, for the dream the two of them shared. And every day he lives here, he is living for a dead man. Levi stopped sweeping. He looked out at Caleb small against the wide Nevada sky. He needs something to live for on his own account. Harlan said, his voice so low the wind nearly carried it away. But I don't know what could be strong enough to break through the walls that man has built around himself. That same morning, half a mile to the east, Hannah Mercer stood in the yard of her ranch feeding her cattle. The air smelled of dry hay and horse sweat and the sharp mineral bite of a desert winter. Around her, cattle lowed softly as they gathered at the feed troughs, their breath rising in white plumes. The ground was hard beneath her boots, frost-locked since November, and the sky above was the kind of deep crystalline blue that only the Nevada desert produced in winter, a blue so sharp it could cut. She was 26 years old and taller than most women in the valley, with shoulders that 3 years of running a ranch alone had shaped into something not broad in the way of a man, but solid in the way of a person who had grown accustomed to carrying whatever the world placed upon them. There was dirt under her fingernails. There was always dirt under her fingernails. She had stopped caring about that a long time ago. Honey-colored hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Eyes the color of new sage, the color her mother's had been the mother she had never known, swept across the herd. Counting. Assessing. 45 head, all healthy. Hay enough for 2 more weeks. She turned to her mare, a sturdy dark bay she had raised from a foal and named Mayor, and laid a hand against the warm neck. The horse breathed into her hair, its exhale warm in the cold air. "Good girl," Hannah said softly. It was a gentleness she reserved for horses. She never let people hear it. From her yard she could see the Thornton Ranch to the west. And if she looked carefully, which she often did more carefully than she would have admitted, she could make out the shape of a man on horseback, alone in his pasture, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his whole life in the saddle. She watched longer than she needed to. Then she spoke to Mayor in a voice so low only the horse could hear. "He's out early again. Never seen a man work that hard with nobody waiting for him at home." She turned back to her work, but something lingered in her expression. Not affection, she would have called it curiosity, empathy, the recognition in someone else of a loneliness she carried herself. Back inside her house, she paused before a framed photograph on the wall. Robert Mercer, her father, standing in front of this very ranch when it was new. His eyes warm, intelligent, determined. 3 qualities his daughter had inherited in full measure. She touched the frame with her fingertips. 3 years now, Papa," she said quietly. "The ranch is still here. I'm still here. Garrett still doesn't have it." She took the rifle from its rack on the wall, checked the action, wiped the barrel. Habit. Then she sat at the table, opened her ledger book, and began to calculate the month's expenses in the light coming through the window. This was Hannah Mercer, a woman who had turned the grief of losing her father into steel, turned the town's isolation into independence, and was holding her ranch not just with strength, but with the intelligence her father had spent a lifetime teaching her. While Caleb checked his herd and Hannah worked her numbers, Silas Garrett sat in the oak-paneled study of the largest ranch house in the Stillwater Valley. The room smelled of cigar smoke and old leather and money. His desk was mahogany shipped from San Francisco at a cost that would have fed a small ranch for a year. On it, a land map of the valley lay, unfolded parcels marked in ink, with the careful hand of a man who understood that ownership begins on paper before it becomes real. The Garrett holdings covered most of the map. Over 5,000 acres accumulated not through labor, but through leverage, through patience, through the precise application of money at the exact moment when other men's misfortune made them desperate enough to sell. But at the center of the map, 2 small parcels sat side by side that he did not yet control, Thornton and Mercer. And one of those parcels held Willow Creek, the best water source in the valley. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything. Garrett turned the gold ring on his left finger, slowly, steadily, like the ticking of a clock that only he could hear. It was his dead wife's wedding band. She had died in childbirth 10 years ago, and he wore the ring not out of grief, but as a reminder that anything could be taken at any moment, and therefore everything must be controlled. "Virgil," he said without looking up. Virgil Hatch stepped from the corner of the room, tall, lean, a face cut from granite with gray eyes that held no warmth. A former deputy dismissed for breaking a prisoner's arm. Garrett had found him in a saloon in Virginia City and made him into a tool. Thornton's loan at First Nevada, Garrett said. How much? $842, 4 years remaining on the installment. Garrett nodded, his eyes still on the map. Buy it. You intend to... Oh, I intend to wait, Garrett said, and the smile on his lips was as thin as a razor. A cowboy lives by his cattle. Winter can take the cattle, and when he has nothing left to pay his debt, he drew a small circle around the Thornton parcel on the map, then dragged his finger across to the Mercer parcel. Miss Mercer loses her last buffer. Ownership is not seizure, Virgil. Ownership is patience. He turned the ring, waited, the way he had waited for 3 years. That afternoon, the sky changed without warning. 1 hour, the sun was cold and bright over the valley. The next, a wall of cloud rolled down from the north, dense and dark as bruised iron swallowing the horizon as it came. The wind shifted from a whisper to a howl in the space of 15 minutes. Caleb stepped onto his porch and felt the change hit him through every sense he had. The cold bit into the skin of his face, not the ordinary chill of a desert winter, but a cold with teeth in it, a cold that meant to kill. His ears filled with the deep, steady roar of wind pouring through the valley like the breathing of something enormous and alive. His eyes saw the white wall advancing from the north, snow not falling, but flying sideways, violent and savage. His nose caught the metallic scent in the air, the smell that every Western cowboy knew and feared, the smell of a real storm. Then he heard it, distant through the wind, the panicked bawling of cattle, the crack of breaking wood, the sound of a fence going down. He ran, the north fence line, the section he knew was weak, the section he had planned to fix tomorrow, when Harlan and Levi came back from town. He had seen the soft posts, the sagging wire. He had told himself one more day would not matter. That decision to wait a single day was about to cost him everything. He found the fence destroyed, posts snapped clean at the base, barbed wire twisted and half buried in the deepening snow. And beyond the gap, disappearing into the white curtain of the storm, the tracks of 60 head of cattle scattering up into the hills where the drifts were already waist-deep and climbing. Harlan and Levi were in Stillwater, gone since yesterday for supplies, certainly trapped there now by the storm. No telegraph wires between the town and the ranch, no way to send word, no way to call for help. Caleb Thornton was completely and absolutely alone. He stood before the broken fence with snow settling on his shoulders, and for one moment, just one, a thought moved through him like a dark current. Let them go. Lose the cattle, lose the ranch, lose everything. What did any of it matter anymore? But then from somewhere deep in memory, a voice spoke to him the way it had spoken 1,000 times before. An 18-year-old voice, bright with the kind of certainty that only the young possess. We're going to build the finest ranch in Nevada, right, brother? Caleb set his jaw, walked into the barn, saddled the gelding, and rode out into the blizzard. He followed the tracks for 2 hours. The snow fell so thick, the hoof prints disappeared almost as fast as they were made. He had to rely on cowboy instinct more than sight reading the terrain, guessing the wind, thinking the way a panicked herd would think. 3 years on the Chisholm Trail had taught him how cattle moved when they were afraid. They ran downwind until they hit something that stopped them, a gully, a stand of trees, a rock wall. Then they bunched together and waited to die. He found 12 head in a ravine to the south, huddled, shaking, but alive. He tried to drive them back toward the ranch using the low, steady voice that the trail had carved into his throat, the voice for singing cattle calm in the long nights on the Kansas prairie. The voice Ethan had once said sounded like their father's, though Caleb had been only 20 at the time. The cattle began to move, slow, in the right direction. Then the gelding spooked. It could have been a coyote in the distance. It could have been nothing more than a sudden shift in the wind. But the horse reared, twisted, and kicked out behind with both hind legs, all 1,000 pounds of force concentrated in iron shoes that caught Caleb square in the right thigh. The pain exploded white. For 3 full seconds, he heard nothing, saw nothing, thought nothing. Only white. Then he was falling. His back hit the snow. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. And when the world came back to him, colors and sound and cold rushing in, all at once the gelding was already 100 yards away, and running hard for the barn, leaving him alone in a white field with a leg that would not hold his weight. Blood ran warm from the gash in his thigh, warm against his skin, for 30 seconds, before the cold froze it solid against the cloth. He could feel the wound pulsing beneath the frozen crust, deep and ugly, the kind of wound that would take weeks to heal properly and might never heal right at all. He tried to stand, his right leg folded under him, and he went down face first in the snow, tasting ice and dirt and his own blood where he had bitten through his lip. He tried again. Same result. The third time he crawled to a juniper trunk, wrapped both arms around it, and hauled himself upright, with a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. All his weight on the left leg. The right leg hung useless, throbbing with each heartbeat, a reminder that the body has its own opinions about what a man should and should not attempt. He stood there in knee-deep snow wind, cutting through his coat blood frozen on his trousers, and stared into the white wall ahead. He could hear cattle lowing somewhere out there, thin, distant, desperate, and he thought, this is what Ethan felt. Alone, no one coming. But Caleb was not Ethan. Caleb was the older brother, the one who had failed to save the younger, and he would not stand by while anything else under his watch died. Not again, not ever again. He found a broken branch thick enough to bear his weight and began to walk. Every step was a war. Right foot touches snow, and the pain rips upward through the thigh and into the hip like a blade being twisted. Snow knee-deep in some places, hip-deep in others, dragging at him with every stride. Wind pushing him back, pushing him down, pushing him to quit. His breath turning to white crystals that froze instantly in his dark beard. Fingers numb inside his gloves. Ears numb, nose numb, but feet still moving. This step, then the next, then the next. Halfway through the worst of it, gasping, teeth clenched against the cold, he muttered to himself, if Harlan could see me now, what would the old man say? He answered in Harlan's voice dry as dust. I told you, Thornton, fix the fence first. But does anyone listen to the old man? No, sir. They do not. He laughed, a short, dry sound that the wind swallowed instantly. And he kept walking. He found them. 30 head, maybe more, pressed together in a stand of juniper trees, their backs white with accumulated snow, their bodies trembling, but alive. They were too cold and too frightened to move. He tried the voice again, the low Chisholm Trail singing voice, but they barely lifted their heads. They needed more than a voice. They needed hands and muscle, and someone to break a trail through the drifts and show them the way home. He needed help. He needed a miracle. And he knew with the cold certainty of a man who had been alone too long that miracles did not come to men like him. Miracles were for people who still believed the world owed them something. Caleb Thornton had stopped believing that the day he picked up his brother's hat from the dirt of a Texas cattle trail and found it still warm. That was when he heard the hoofbeats. At first he was certain the cold had gotten into his head. He knew the symptom. Every cowboy did. When the cold goes deep enough past the skin, past the muscle, down into the place where thought lives, you begin to hear things that are not there. He had seen it happen on the trail. Grown men talking to dead friends as if they were sitting right beside them. Men pointing at houses and trees that existed only in the failing light behind their eyes. But the sound grew clearer. Steady, confident, hooves striking snow with the rhythm of a horse being ridden by someone who knew exactly where they were going. And out of the white curtain of the blizzard, a shape materialized. A dark bay mare, strong and sure-footed, moving through the deep snow with the kind of steady power that only a well-bred horse possesses. On the mare's back, a rider in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat pulled low, sitting the saddle with the easy balance of someone who had been riding since before they could walk. Back straight, hips rolling with the horse's gait, hands light on the reins but in complete control. As the rider drew closer, Caleb recognized her. Not a man, Hannah Mercer, from the ranch next door. She pulled the mare up beside him and looked down from the saddle. Her eyes moved across him, head to boots, in exactly 2 seconds. The injured leg, the blood frozen dark on his trousers, the broken branch he was leaning on, the exhaustion written in every line of his body. She took it all in and understood everything in a single glance. You are hurt, she said. It was not a question. Horse kicked me, Caleb said through teeth that wanted to chatter. I need to get these cattle home before they freeze. Hannah dismounted without another word. No questions, no complaints, no hesitation, no fear, no wasted moment asking why or how or what had happened. She simply got off the horse and began to work the way a person does when they understand that action is the only language that matters when death is close enough to smell. She stood beside him, and in the closeness, Caleb could see what he had never bothered to see in 5 years of living on the next ranch over. Honey-colored hair loose under her hat where the wind had torn it free, face red from the cold, but eyes absolutely steady, and her hands, rough working hands already moving to the mare's reins with the kind of practical efficiency that did not waste a single motion. "You cannot walk on that leg," she said, coming to his side. "Get on my horse." "I can manage," Caleb said. "Don't be stupid," Hannah said. Her voice held no harshness, no anger, just plain truth spoken directly into the face of pride. "You will be dead in an hour if you keep trying to walk through this storm. Get on the horse and help me drive these cattle. Two people can do what one cannot." Caleb looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Not the glance across a fence line, not the nod on the road to town. He saw the human being standing before him in the middle of a blizzard. A woman who had ridden into a white death to save the cattle of a man she barely knew. Not because she had to, because she chose to. Something shifted inside him. Something that had been locked and sealed for 6 years. He let her help him into the saddle. He bit down hard on the inside of his cheek to keep from crying out when his injured leg scraped against the horse's flank. And Hannah took the reins and began to move toward the cattle, calling to them in a voice that carried over the wind. Low, steady, full of authority. The cattle stirred. They recognized a human presence that meant safety, that meant warmth, that meant someone had come for them. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to move. They had a long way to go, and the light was fading fast. They worked together for the next hour in a kind of desperate partnership that neither of them had expected or planned. Hannah on foot leading the mare, breaking trail through waist-deep drifts, then circling back to shove stragglers forward. Caleb in the saddle, using his voice and his presence on horseback to keep the herd bunched and pointed in the right direction. This was pure cowboy work, the kind of work that 3 years on the Chisholm Trail had carved into his bones. A cowboy on horseback with the right voice could hold 400 head. 30 frightened cattle in a blizzard were within his ability, even injured, even half-frozen, even fading. But his voice alone was not enough. Hannah was the arms, the legs, the brute physical force that his broken body could no longer provide. She moved through the snow with a ruthless efficiency that left no step wasted, no motion unnecessary. When a stubborn bull turned and tried to break away, she went after it, grabbed its horn, and muscled it back into the group with nothing but her own strength and an expression on her face that said she had dealt with the creatures far more difficult than this one. When the snow ahead grew too deep, she waded through it first with her own boots, stamping a path for the cattle to follow. Her coat turned white with snow. Her face burned red from the wind. The cold bit at her through every layer she wore. But she did not slow down. She did not complain. She did not stop. The wind howled through the valley like an organ playing all its notes at once. Snow cut into exposed skin like fine sand. The smell of wet cattle hair filled the air, warm and rank and alive, mixing with the cold metallic taste of the storm itself. The low bellowing of frightened animals. The crunch of hooves in deep snow. Hannah's voice calling out to the herd steady and firm against the gale. And beneath all of it, the sound of Caleb's own heartbeat fast and hard, not just from the cold or the pain, but from something shifting deep inside his chest as he watched this woman tear through the blizzard to save his cattle. Caleb watched her work and realized with a clarity that was almost painful that he had lived 5 years on the ranch next to hers and had never truly seen her. He had seen his neighbor. He had seen Miss Mercer. He had seen a woman living alone. But he had never seen Hannah, the human being who was ripping through a killing storm by sheer force of will because it was the right thing to do. "Why did you come out here?" he called down to her above the wind. Hannah looked up at him. Snowflakes caught on her eyelashes and melted instantly from the warmth of her skin. "I saw your horse come back without you. I knew you were in trouble. You could have frozen to death out here." "So could you," Hannah said. Then she turned back to the work, matter of fact, without drama, as if risking her life for a neighbor's cattle were the most ordinary thing in the world. And that was exactly what made it extraordinary. They made it through the draw as the last gray light was bleeding out of the sky. Hannah had found the gap in the terrain that Caleb pointed to, the shallow gully where a frozen creek wound between low hills, and she had turned the lead cattle into it with the confidence of a woman who understood land the way some people understand language. The snow was not as deep here, sheltered by the ridgeline, and the cattle picked up their pace as if they could smell something familiar ahead. Safety, hay, the windbreak they had huddled against through other winters. Caleb was fading. He knew it the way a man knows when the ground is about to give way beneath him. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, the edges soft and dark. The cold had stopped hurting, which was the most dangerous sign of all. When the cold stops hurting, it means the body has stopped fighting. He gripped the saddle horn with both hands and held on through will alone, because Hannah Mercer was out there in the snow breaking trail for his cattle, and he would not fall off this horse while she was still standing. The ranch buildings appeared through the snow like something conjured from a dream. The barn, the corral, the small house he had built with his own hands. The cattle saw them too, and something ancient in their blood recognized home, and they began to trot, then to run, stumbling through the drifts toward the dark shapes of shelter. Hannah sprinted ahead and threw open the gate to the winter pasture. The cattle streamed through, pressing together in the narrow opening hooves, churning the snow to mud their breath, rising in a great cloud of white. She counted them as they passed. When the last animal was through, she swung the gate shut and turned back toward Caleb. He was sliding off the horse. She covered the distance in 4 strides, reaching him just as his grip on the saddle horn failed. His weight came down on her, 180 pounds of frozen cowboy, and she braced herself the way she braced against a calf when it tried to bolt it during branding. Legs wide, shoulders set. She caught him and lowered him to the ground as gently as the situation allowed. "Stay with me," she said, and her voice cut through the fog in his head like a blade through cloth. Caleb opened his eyes. Her face was very close, eyes bright with worry, snowflakes melting in her hair, breath coming in hard clouds between them. He had never been this close to another human being in 6 years. The nearness of her was almost more shocking than the cold. "The other cattle," he mumbled, "still out there. Forget the other cattle right now. We need to get you inside." She got her shoulder under his arm and half carried, half dragged him across the yard to the house. He tried to help, tried to make his legs work, but the right one had given up entirely and the left was not far behind. She kicked the door open with her boot and brought him through into darkness that smelled of cold ash and dust and the faint ghost of coffee from that morning a lifetime ago. She lowered him onto the bed and went to work immediately. No hesitation, no panic. She moved through the dark house with the efficiency of a woman who had nursed her own father through injury and understood that speed and calm were the only medicines that mattered when a body was shutting down. She found matches on the mantel and had the stove lit within minutes. The first crackle of flame was the most beautiful sound Caleb had heard in his life. She found blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed and piled them over him, then began pulling off his frozen coat, his boots, his blood-stiffened trousers, working with steady hands that did not flinch when she saw the wound. The gash on his thigh was ugly, a deep bruise already turning black and purple, spreading from hip to knee with a long tear in the skin where the iron shoe had cut through cloth and flesh together. Blood had soaked the fabric and frozen into a dark crust that crackled when she peeled it away. She cleaned it with whiskey from a bottle she found on the shelf, and the burn of alcohol on raw flesh brought Caleb fully awake for the first time since the pasture gate. He watched her work through eyes that were learning to focus again. The firelight had begun to fill the room with warmth and amber shadow, and in that light Hannah Mercer looked like something more than a neighbor helping with an injury. She looked like a woman who had done this before, who had sat beside a bed and cleaned a wound and willed the person in it to survive, and who carried the scar of the one time it had not worked. She bandaged the leg with clean cloth torn from a shirt she found in his drawer, wrapping it tight and sure. Then she made coffee, strong and black and hot enough to scald. She sat on the edge of the bed and helped him drink, holding the cup steady when his hands shook too badly to grip it himself. The coffee burned down his throat and into his chest, and he felt the world solidify around him. Colors sharpened, sounds clarified. He was alive. He was in his own house, in his own bed, and a woman he barely knew was sitting beside him with firelight turning her hair to gold. "Thank you," he said. The two words carried more weight than they usually did. They carried the weight of a life just pulled back from the edge. Hannah met his eyes and something passed between them that neither had been prepared for. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two lonely souls seeing each other clearly for the first time. You would have done the same for me, she said quietly. I hope I would have been that brave, Caleb said. A faint color rose in Hannah's cheeks, and she looked away toward the fire. You should rest. I will check on the cattle and see to your animals. The storm, Caleb began, is easing, Hannah finished. I can handle things. You need to heal. She stood and started to move toward the door, but Caleb reached out and caught her hand. She stopped, looked back at him, surprised. Stay, he said. At least until morning. The storm might come back, and I would never forgive myself if something happened to you riding home. Hannah hesitated. He could see her weighing propriety against practicality. A woman alone in a man's house overnight, in a town small enough to count every whisper. But the wind was still howling outside and the dark was deep, and the practical woman in her won the argument the way she always did. I will stay, she said, but I am sleeping in your chair, not your bed. I would not have suggested otherwise, Caleb said. But there was the ghost of a smile on his face as he said it, and Hannah saw it, and something softened in her expression before she turned away. She went out into the storm to tend the animals. Caleb lay in his bed listening to the wind, and for the first time in 6 years, the presence of another person in his home did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like relief, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed too long. His eyes drifted to the hat on the bedpost. Ethan's hat. He had talked to it every night for 6 years, told it about his day, about the cattle, about the weather, kept up a conversation with a ghost because the alternative was silence, and silence was where the grief lived. Tonight, for the first time, he did not want to talk to the hat. He wanted to talk to her. When Hannah came back inside, she was covered in snow and shivering hard. She stripped off her wet coat and hung it by the stove to dry, pulled off her boots and set them nearby. She poured herself coffee and sank into the chair she had pulled close to the fire, wrapping her hands around the cup, and for a moment with the firelight on her face and exhaustion in every line of her body, she looked not strong or capable or formidable, but simply human, tired and cold and far from the home she had built for herself. All the animals are settled, she said. Your horse came back and is in the barn with mine. The cattle we brought in are huddled by the hay. They will make it. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the walls. Caleb could not stop looking at her, at the way the firelight played across her features, the determined set of her jaw even in repose. Why did you really come looking for me? He asked. Hannah did not answer right away. She stared into her coffee cup as if it held something she was not sure she wanted to find. I already told you, I saw your horse without you. A lot of people would have figured I could take care of myself. Maybe, she paused. But I know what it is like to be out there alone when things go wrong. And then she told him about her father, about Robert Mercer, the man who had taught her to read Latin and brand cattle in the same afternoon, about the accident 3 years ago, a fence post falling, pinning his leg, leaving him alone in the desert sun for hours, while his daughter was at the far end of the ranch and did not know. About finding him that evening dehydrated and broken, his eyes already going dim, his voice a whisper that said, My girl, I knew you would come. He died 3 months later, Hannah said, and her voice, the voice that had been steady through blizzard and blood and exhaustion, trembled for the first time. Infection. Started the day of the accident. The doctor did everything he could, but there was no fighting it. Not out here. Not in 1880. She was quiet. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. So when I saw your horse come back alone, I did not think about it. I just went, because I know what it feels like to find someone too late. Something tightened deep in Caleb's chest, not sympathy, something larger. The recognition that she too carried a wound, that she too had lost the person who mattered most, that she too was living alone with a ghost. I am sorry about your father, he said. He was a good man, Hannah said softly. He never treated me as less capable because I was his daughter instead of his son. When he died, people in town expected me to sell the ranch and move back east to live with relatives. Garrett was already waiting with an offer. But the ranch is yours, Caleb said. Not a question. The ranch is mine, and I will work it until I cannot work anymore. I believe you will, Caleb said, and he meant it completely. Anyone who can ride through a blizzard the way you did today, nothing in this world is going to beat that person. Hannah looked at him then, really looked at him. The way she had looked at him in the snow, reading everything that was written on his face and behind his eyes. And Caleb felt it, the sensation of being seen and all the way through, past every wall he had built, past the grief and the guilt and the 6 years of talking to a dead boy's hat. You lost someone too, she said. Not a question. Caleb was silent. His eyes moved to the hat on the bedpost. You do not have to tell me, Hannah said gently. I just want you to know that I recognize pain when I see it, because I carry it myself. She did not push. She did not pry. She simply sat in the chair by the fire and let the silence be what it was, not empty, but full, the kind of silence that says, I am here and I am not going anywhere. Caleb closed his eyes and let himself drift, knowing she was there watching over him. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the sound of her adding wood to the fire. It was the most comforting sound he had heard in years. He woke once in the night. Hannah was still in the chair, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even. He watched her sleep for a moment, this woman who had ridden into a blizzard for a man she barely knew, and he felt something crack open inside him that he had thought was sealed forever. The second time he woke, she was standing beside the bed, her hand cool on his forehead, checking for fever. Her touch was gentle, and Caleb's breath caught because it had been so long since anyone had touched him with care. Go back to sleep, she whispered. He did, and he dreamed. The Chisholm Trail, 1877, red dust and white sun, and the bawling of 400 cattle strung out across the Texas plain. Caleb, 22 years old, riding the left flank. Ethan, 18, riding the right. Thin and quick on his horse, grinning under a hat too big for his head, their father's hat, the one he wore because he said it brought luck. Ethan waved across the herd. Caleb watched this. He spurred his horse into a gallop along the column of cattle lariat, spinning overhead, and caught a straying calf clean around the neck. Pulled it back to the herd in a single smooth motion. Laughed, proud of himself, the way only an 18-year-old can be proud fully and without reservation. Caleb watched his brother and thought, that kid is going to be the best cowboy in Texas. Then the dust changed. The sound changed. The lazy rumble of cattle on the move became something else, something deeper, something that vibrated through the ground and up through the horse and into Caleb's bones. Stampede. 400 animals running blind, the earth shaking under the weight of them, dust so thick the sun disappeared. Ethan was on the wrong side. He was trying to turn the leaders, the most dangerous job on the trail work meant for experienced hands, not for an 18-year-old boy on his third drive. Caleb saw him across the herd and screamed his name, but the wind and the dust and the thunder of hooves swallowed the sound. Ethan's horse stumbled, a gopher hole hidden in the grass. The horse went down and Ethan flew from the saddle, arms wide, hat spinning away, and landed in the path of 400 head of running cattle. Caleb spurred his horse hard, rode faster than he had ever ridden. But the distance was too far, and the cattle were too fast, and the last thing he saw before the dust closed over everything was his brother's face looking up, mouth open, calling his name. Then silence. The worst kind of silence. The silence that comes after the sound you will hear for the rest of your life. When the dust settled, Caleb found him, lying in the trampled ground, the hat 3 yards away, eyes open, staring at the sky but seeing nothing anymore. Caleb woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart slamming against his ribs. The room was dark. The fire had burned low, and Hannah was there beside the bed, her hand on his arm, her eyes calm and steady in the dim light. You were calling a name, she said softly. Ethan. Caleb looked at her. In the darkness, she did not ask. She did not push. She simply waited. My brother, Caleb said. And these were the first words he had spoken about Ethan to any living person in 6 years. Lost on the Chisholm Trail 6 years ago. Stampede. I was there, I saw it happen, and I could not reach him in time. His voice broke, not much, but enough. Hannah said nothing. She took his hand, held it tight, and sat with him in the dark while the fire crackled low and the wind moaned outside, and Caleb Thornton let someone inside the walls for the first time since the day his brother died. You did not kill your brother, Hannah said after a long time. You lost your brother. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and you have punished yourself long enough for the wrong one. Morning came gray and cold, but the wind had died. Hannah was already up cooking breakfast from what she found in his kitchen: bacon and eggs and coffee. The smell filled the small house, and Caleb's stomach reminded him that he had not eaten since the morning before, which felt like a different lifetime. She went back out before he woke, fully riding into the dawn alone. When she returned 2 hours later, she had found 17 more head, sheltered in the ravine Caleb had mentioned, and driven them down to his winter pasture. Over the course of that day, she rode out twice more, each time returning with cattle. By nightfall, she had recovered 59 of the original 60. One was lost. Somewhere in the snow under a white blanket, one animal had not made it. 59 out of 60 is better than anyone could have hoped, Hannah said. She stayed a second night. Chair not bed, same arrangement, same firelight, but something between them had shifted, and they both knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, while Caleb's leg healed and the snow melted slowly from the valley, Hannah came to his ranch nearly every day. She brought food. She brought news. Sometimes she brought nothing but herself, sitting by the fire and talking with him about ranching and life and all the small things that two people need to know to understand each other. He learned that she loved horses more than cattle, that she could discuss Virgil's Aeneid in the original Latin because her father had insisted on a proper education, that she was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with never finding someone who saw her as she was. He told her about Missouri and the fever that took his parents, about the Chisholm Trail, not the dark part, but the beautiful part, the night skies of Texas, a million stars scattered across black velvet, the sound of cattle settling at dusk, the freedom of riding an open plain at sunset with nothing between you and the horizon. Harlan and Levi returned 3 days after the storm. Harlan walked into the house, saw Hannah pouring coffee in Caleb's kitchen, saw the way Caleb smiled at something she said, and turned to Levi with a look that 57 years of living had taught him to keep mostly to himself. "You know, Levi," Harlan said quietly, "I have lived 57 years on this earth, but I have never once seen a horse kick its owner and have it turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to him." On the 12th night, Hannah brought a book, the Aeneid. She read aloud to Caleb when pain kept him from sleeping, her voice turning the Latin into something that sounded like music. He had never learned anything beyond riding and roping and the hard arithmetic of keeping cattle alive, and the beauty of the language moved through him in a way he did not expect. "What is it about?" he asked. "A man who lost his city, lost his wife, wandered across the sea, and built Rome from the ashes." She looked at him. He understood what she was not saying. She understood that he understood. When Caleb rode into Stillwater for the first time after the blizzard, he noticed the looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into the general store, the knowing smiles. Martha Crawford at the drugstore asking in a voice sweet as poison whether Miss Mercer had taken good care of him. Hannah Mercer had spent 2 nights at Caleb Thornton's house, alone in 1883 in a town that counted its sins by the teaspoon that was enough to fuel gossip for months. Hannah heard about it before he did. She came to the ranch with a face more serious than usual. "People in town are talking about us," she said. "No preamble, no softening." "Let them talk," Caleb said. "I am not ashamed of anything." "Neither am I, but Garrett will use this." She was right, and the clock they did not yet know about was already ticking. On a February evening when the worst of winter had passed and the days had begun to stretch toward spring, Hannah arrived at Caleb's door, looking nervous in a way he had never seen. "I have been thinking," she said, "about us, about what this is, and I think we need to decide what we want. Because I cannot keep coming here every day and kissing you goodbye and going home to an empty house. It is driving me out of my mind." Caleb crossed the room and stood before her. "I am not just falling in love with you," he said. "I have already fallen. I have been in love with you since I watched you push through that blizzard without a moment of hesitation. For 6 years, I have been living for a dead man. You are the first reason I have had to live for someone who is still breathing." Hannah stared at him, the eyes that had been steady through storm and danger and grief filled with tears. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick. "I love you, Caleb Thornton." "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast. I know it is too soon, but life is too short and too uncertain for waiting. Marry me, Hannah." Yes, she said. Yes. He pulled her close and kissed her, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. It was a kiss that spoke of commitment and hunger, and a future they would build together the way they had driven the cattle through the storm, side by side, step by step, neither one looking back. That evening, after Hannah had gone home, Caleb stood alone in his room. He looked at the hat on the bedpost. Ethan's hat. The hat he had talked to every night for 6 years. He lifted it gently from the post, held it for a moment, feeling the worn leather, the faded brim. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in a wooden box beneath the bed, and closed the lid. "Goodbye, Ethan," he whispered. "I am not forgetting you. I am just learning how to live again." They were married 3 weeks later in the smaller church in Stillwater and with half the town in attendance. Caleb wore his best suit. Hannah wore a simple cream dress. Reverend Josiah Clark performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them, man and wife, the kiss they shared made Harlan Dawson reach for his handkerchief. "Dust in my eye," Harlan muttered when Levi caught him wiping his face. "Inside a church," Levi said. "Shut up, Levi." But not everyone in that church was happy. Silas Garrett sat in the last pew, his face blank, his fingers turning the gold ring on his left hand. He left before the ceremony ended, Hannah noticed. She squeezed Caleb's hand, and the warmth of it steadied her against the chill that Garrett's presence always brought. The question of where to live was settled practically, as most things were when Hannah was involved. Her ranch was larger and had a better house, so Caleb moved his operation to her land, combining their herds and resources into one larger enterprise. It made financial sense, and it meant they did not have to be apart. 3 months after the wedding, the blow fell. A man named Edwin Price arrived at the ranch, a lawyer from Carson City, in a pressed suit and polished boots. He carried papers, legal papers. Garrett had purchased Caleb's outstanding loan from the First Nevada Bank, $842 with the terms rewritten to demand full payment within 90 days. Money that Caleb did not have. Money that would require selling nearly every animal he owned. Caleb read the documents in silence. His hands did not shake, but the muscles in his jaw worked the way they worked when he was holding back something that wanted to come out as violence. "He does not want my land," Caleb said to Hannah after the lawyer had gone. "He wants yours. I am just the wall he needs to tear down first." Hannah listened. Her face went white, but her eyes blazed. "He will not win," she said, and her voice carried the same steel it had carried in the blizzard, the same certainty, the same refusal to bend. "My father taught me that knowledge is a weapon stronger than money. Garrett has money, but we have brains, and we have each other." She opened the ledger book that night and began to plan. Sell 20 head at the Virginia City market where Garrett could not control the prices. Time it right, and the post-winter shortage would drive the price high enough to cover the debt. It would be close. It would be tight. But it was possible. Caleb and Harlan drove the cattle to Virginia City, 3 days through the desert. Levi stayed behind to watch the ranch. At the cattle market, the winter shortage had done exactly what Hannah predicted. They sold 20 head at $45 each, $900, enough to pay the debt with $58 to spare. Caleb rode back to Stillwater, walked into the lawyer's office, and laid $912 in cash on the desk. Every last cent. Price counted it, stamped the loan papers as paid in full, and handed Caleb the canceled note. That night, Caleb gave the paper to Hannah. She held it with trembling hands. It was the first time he had ever seen her hands tremble. "It is done," he said. "He gets nothing." Hannah looked up at him, and the tears that ran down her face were not tears of weakness. They were the tears of a woman who had carried a weight too heavy for too long and had finally been allowed to set it down. "We did it," she whispered. "Together." But the victory had a case. 20 head sold meant 20 fewer cattle earning their keep. And the summer that followed, their first summer as husband and wife, brought a drought that turned the valley into a furnace. The rain stopped in May and did not return. June was dry. July was worse. August turned the grassland to brown paper that crumbled underfoot. Willow Creek, the lifeblood of the Mercer Ranch and the prize Garrett had been after for years, still ran, but it thinned each week, shrinking from a stream to a trickle to a thread of silver over stones. The cattle grew thin. Hay had to be purchased, an expense that their budget stretched razor thin by the debt repayment could not easily bear. Each evening, Caleb and Hannah sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, working the numbers by lamplight, trying to find money that was not there. This was the first real test of their marriage. Not the blizzard, which had been a crisis with a clear enemy. Not Garrett, who was a problem that strategy could solve. This was the grinding daily pressure of two strong-willed people who had each spent years making decisions alone, now forced to make them together. Caleb, cowboy to his bones, wanted to buy more cattle while the prices were low. His instinct told him the drought would break, and when it did, the man with the biggest herd would profit most. You invest when times are hard, he said. That is how you build something. Hannah, the planner, the calculator, the woman who kept the books and knew exactly what every cent was doing, wanted to hold their cash. We cannot feed the animals we already have, she said, and her voice carried a sharpness that surprised them both. You want to buy more mouths when we cannot fill the ones we have. That is not investment, Caleb. That is gambling. Gambling is what built every ranch in this valley, Caleb shot back, and bankruptcy is what emptied half of them. They stared at each other across the table. The lamp flickered between them. Outside, the heat pressed against the windows, even at night, relentless, patient like the drought itself. It was the first time they had raised their voices at each other. It would not be the last. But what happened next was what mattered, and it was what would define their marriage for the next 40 years. Hannah set down her pencil. Caleb unclenched his jaw. And they looked at each other not as opponents, but as partners who had temporarily forgotten which side they were on. 10 head, Hannah said, not 20. We buy 10 piston at the low price, and we keep a reserve for emergencies. Because I am carrying our child Caleb, and I will not gamble with our family's future. It was the first time she had said it aloud. The pregnancy she had suspected for 2 weeks confirmed that morning by the absence of her monthly cycle and a certainty that lived in her body deeper than any ledger could record. Caleb stared at her. The argument drained out of him like water from a cracked jug. You are carrying our child, he repeated, and the words sounded different in his mouth than they had in hers. In hers, they had been a fact used to win an argument. In his, they were the beginning of a world he had never dared to imagine. 10 head, he said, in a reserve. They shook hands across the table formal, as business partners, and then they both laughed at the absurdity of it, and Caleb came around the table and took her in his arms and held her for a long time without speaking, feeling the new weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders, like something he had been waiting to carry without knowing it. The decision proved exactly right. They bought 10 head cheap. The drought broke in September. Prices rose. And the cash reserve Hannah had insisted on saved them when a bout of cattle sickness swept through the valley in October, requiring expensive medicine that their neighbors who had not held back reserves could not afford. It was the pattern of their marriage established that summer and repeated countless times over the decades to come. Caleb's instinct and Hannah's calculation, his courage and her caution, his willingness to risk and her insistence on a plan. Apart, each approach had weaknesses. Together, they were formidable. But Garrett was not finished. Men like Silas Garrett are never finished. The debt had been a chess move and it had failed. But there were other moves on the board. And somewhere in the hills to the north, the next one was already being prepared. Harlan found the tracks on a Tuesday morning in late December when the winter cold had settled into the valley and the ground was hard as iron beneath the frost. He rode back to the ranch at a pace that made Caleb look up from the corral fence he was mending, because Harlan Dawson did not hurry his horse for anything less than serious trouble. 15 head gone from the north section, Harlan said, still in the saddle, his face set in the hard lines of a man delivering news he wished he did not have. Not strayed, driven. 3 riders shod horses moved them north through the hills sometime in the last 2 days. And Caleb, one set of those tracks I recognize. Virgil Hatch's horse. That big roan with the chipped shoe on the left front. Caleb put down the hammer. He looked toward the house where Hannah was resting in the warmth of the front room, 4 months along now, the curve of the child visible beneath her dress when she stood in profile against the window light. Garrett, Caleb said. Virgil ran the operation, used Tom Becker and 2 others to do the driving. But the orders came from the big house. They always do. Caleb went inside. Hannah was at the table with the ledger open in front of her, a pencil in her hand the way she always was when the numbers needed watching. He told her, She listened without interrupting, her face still, her eyes moving from his face to the window and back again. "Be careful," she said when he finished. Her voice was level, but her hand found his arm and gripped it with a pressure that said everything her words did not. "Always," Caleb said. He kissed her. He kissed the swell of her belly where his child was growing. Then he walked to the barn, saddled his horse, and rode north with Harlan and Levi into the dry hills. They followed the tracks for 2 days. Caleb read the ground the way the Chisholm Trail had taught him, the way a man reads a book written in dust and bent grass and the faint impressions of hooves on hard earth. 3 horses, 15 cattle, moving at a pace that said the riders knew where they were going and were in no particular hurry to get there. The arrogance of men who believed they would not be followed. They camped the first night in a dry wash, eating jerky and hardtack and drinking coffee so bitter it could strip paint. Harlan sat across the fire with his Winchester across his knees, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "Caleb," Harlan said quietly, "you have a wife at home, a child on the way. Do not be a hero." "I am not being a hero. I am getting back what is mine." And there's a difference between brave and stupid, and the distance between them is about the width of a bullet. Caleb looked at the old man across the fire. Harlan had fought at Shiloh, had buried friends on the Chisholm Trail, had survived everything the West could throw at a man for nearly 6 decades. When Harlan Dawson told you to be careful, the words carried the weight of every grave he had ever dug. "I hear you," Caleb said. "Good, because I did not ride 2 days through this cold to carry you home across a saddle." On the second evening, from a ridge overlooking a hidden valley, they saw a firelight, 3 men sitting around a camp. Beyond them, in a makeshift corral of rope and brush, 15 cattle bearing the Thornton brand stood quiet in the dusk. Virgil Hatch was not among the 3. He had delivered his orders and ridden back to Garrett's ranch, keeping his own hands clean, while Becker and the others did the dirty work. "Levi," Caleb said, "circle left." "Harlan, right. I am riding straight in." 5 minutes, Harlan said. "After that, I make no promises about staying quiet." Caleb rode down the slope at a walk, slow, deliberate. He let the hoofbeats carry ahead of him so the 3 men would hear him coming. He did not try to hide. On the Chisholm Trail, when trouble found you, the worst thing you could do was sneak. You rode straight at it. You looked it in the eye. You let the other man decide whether the fight was worth having. Tom Becker stood up from the fire. A big man heavy through the shoulders with a drooping mustache and eyes that had the dull sheen of a man who had done questionable things for money and had long since stopped questioning them. The 2 men beside him rose as well, hands drifting toward their belts. Caleb stopped his horse 10 yards from the fire. He rested his right hand on the colt at his hip. Did not draw it, did not need to. The gesture said enough. "Tom," Caleb said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather across a fence, "those are my cattle. I want them back." "Found them wandering," Becker said. "No brand I recognized. My cattle carry a T inside a circle on the left hip. I burned that brand into 60 head with my own hands one at a time, and I know exactly who sent you to take them. Virgil gave you the orders. Garrett gave him the money. So here is how this goes. You walk away, and I forget this happened. Or I drag you to the sheriff in Stillwater, and I make certain he knows whose money paid for this little ride." Becker's eyes moved across Caleb, measuring. 1 man on horseback, a cowboy with a pistol and a look in his eyes that said he had seen worse things than this and had not blinked. From the hillside to the left, the sound of Harlan clearing his throat carried across the still air. Becker turned his head and saw the old man sitting his horse on the ridge, a Winchester resting easy across his thighs, the barrel catching the last of the daylight. From the right, Levi Hollis, young and smiling in a way that did not quite reach his eyes, sat his own horse with his hand on his sidearm. 3 against 3. Fair odds. Fairer than Becker had counted on. The big man stepped back from the fire. "Take the cattle," he said, "but watch your back, Thornton." "Tell Garrett something for me," Caleb said, and his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but something in it made Becker go still. "Next time he wants something of mine, he can come get it himself. I will be happy to discuss it with him." They drove the cattle home through the night, arriving at the ranch gate just as the sun was coming up over the eastern hills. Hannah was standing on the porch, one hand pressed to her belly and the other shading her eyes against the dawn. When she saw Caleb ride in with 15 head ahead of him, her shoulders dropped half an inch. It was the only sign of the fear she had been carrying for 2 days. But Hannah Mercer Thornton had not spent those 2 days sitting in a chair wringing her hands. While Caleb was tracking cattle through the northern hills, Hannah had saddled Mayor and ridden into Stillwater. She had found Tom Becker in the saloon before he left to meet Virgil's men at the rendezvous point because Hannah understood something that Caleb, for all his cowboy courage, did not. Fists and guns win fights, but paper wins wars. Becker had been drunk and scared. Scared of Garrett, scared of Virgil, scared of prison, scared of the rope that Nevada law prescribed for cattle theft. Hannah sat across from him with her unborn child heavy in her body and her eyes steady as stone, and she offered him the only thing he wanted more than Garrett's money. A way out. She gave him paper. She gave him a pen. And Tom Becker, his hand shaking, wrote a detailed statement naming Silas Garrett as the man who had ordered the theft and Virgil Hatch as the man who had delivered the instructions and payment. Hannah took the statement to the notary, had it witnessed and sealed, and placed it in the vault at the First Nevada Bank with instructions that were as clear as the woman who wrote them. If anything happens to the Thornton family, their ranch, or their cattle, this document goes to the county sheriff within 24 hours. She told Caleb about the statement that morning, standing on the porch while the recovered cattle milled in the pasture and the sun burned away the last of the night. "When did you see Becker?" Caleb asked. "2 days ago, while you were in the hills. You rode to town alone, 4 months pregnant, to confront a man who steals cattle for a living. I rode to town to have a conversation with a man who was more afraid of prison than he was of me. There is a difference." Caleb stared at her. Then he shook his head, and a sound came out of him that was half laugh, half something else entirely. "Hannah Thornton, you are the most dangerous woman in this valley." "I am the most practical woman in this valley," Hannah corrected. "Dangerous would mean I enjoyed it. I simply did what needed to be done." But the war was not over yet, because 3 days later, Garrett came to them. It was early morning. Caleb had ridden out at dawn to check the north fence line, the same fence that had started everything, the fence he had rebuilt stronger after the blizzard and checked every week since. Harlan and Levi were with him. Hannah was alone at the ranch house. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders coming up the road from the south, moving at the unhurried pace of men who believed the land they rode across already belonged to them. She recognized the lead horse before she recognized the rider. A tall gray gelding that Silas Garrett rode through Stillwater like a man on parade. Hannah went inside. She took the Winchester from the rack on the wall, checked the action, loaded it, walked back out to the pasture gate, and stood there with the rifle across her chest, the barrel pointed at the road, and waited. Garrett stopped 30 yards out. Virgil Hatch sat to his right, lean and sharp, his hand resting on his thigh near the holster. To Garrett's left, a ranch hand whose name Hannah did not know and did not care to learn. This was the moment, the scene that had been waiting since the first page of this story. "Mrs. Thornton," Garrett said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime getting what he wanted. "I have come with a final offer, and this time I strongly suggest you listen." Hannah raised the rifle barrel half an inch, just enough for the steel to catch the morning light. "Tell your dog to sit still," she said, "or I will assume he is here to cause trouble, and I will respond accordingly. I grew up on this ranch, Mr. Hatch. My father taught me to shoot coyotes at 200 yards. You are considerably closer than that." Virgil's hands stopped moving. Garrett sat his horse in silence for a long moment. The gold ring turned. His face was unreadable, but something behind his eyes had shifted. For the first time in 3 years of trying to take Hannah Mercer's land, he was looking at her and seeing not a problem to be solved, but an opponent who had beaten him. "You are making a mistake," Garrett said quietly. "No, Mr. Garrett, you made the mistake. 3 years ago, when you looked at a 23-year-old woman standing alone on her father's ranch and thought she would be easy to break." Hannah's voice did not waver. "I am not easy to break. I never was. And now I have a husband who will stand beside me and a piece of paper that will put you in prison if you ever come near us again. So turn your horses around, ride back to your ranch, and do not come here again." Garrett held her gaze for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he pulled the reins, turned his horse, and rode away without another word. Virgil followed. The ranch hand followed Virgil. Hannah stood at the gate until they were out of sight. Then she lowered the rifle and her hands began to shake. Not from fear, from the release of it. the way a drawn bow shakes when the arrow is finally let go. When Caleb returned an hour later and she told him what had happened, his face went through three colors in rapid succession. White with fear for what could have happened, red with anger that he had not been there, and then something else, something that had no color, only warmth. You faced down Garrett and Virgil Hatch, alone, with a rifle and a baby in your belly. I faced down a bully and his hired hand, Hannah said. The rifle helped. 2 days later, Caleb and Hannah rode together to Garrett's ranch to deliver the final message. Not with rifles this time, but with something more powerful. Certainty. Garrett's ranch house stood at the head of the valley like a monument to one man's appetite. White painted columns flanked the front door. Glass windows, real glass, shipped from San Francisco, caught the morning light. A porch wrapped around three sides, and on it, two rocking chairs sat empty because Silas Garrett was not a man who sat and watched. He was a man who planned and took. They were shown into the parlor by a house servant who would not meet their eyes. The room smelled of cigar smoke and bourbon. Oil paintings of landscapes that Garrett had never visited hung on walls paneled in dark wood. Crystal decanters of whiskey caught the light from a window that looked out over 5,000 acres of land, acquired through patience and other people's misfortune. Garrett sat behind his mahogany desk. He did not stand when they entered. He did not offer his hand. He offered drinks with the smooth courtesy of a man who believed hospitality was another form of control. They refused. Virgil Hatch stood in the corner silent as furniture, his gray eyes moving between Caleb and Hannah, with the flat assessment of a man who calculated threat the way other men calculated distance. Hannah spoke first. Her voice was calm. Her words were precise. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Mr. Garrett, 3 days ago I told you what I have in that bank vault. I see you did not believe me because here we are again. So let me be clear one final time. That document is real. It is sealed. And it will destroy you if you test me again. My father taught me that knowledge is power. Now you know exactly what power I hold. Do not touch our ranch again. Garrett's face did not change, but his hand, the one that had been turning the gold ring, went still. That was the tell. In a man who controlled every expression, every gesture, every word, the sudden stillness of his hand was the equivalent of a scream. The silence that followed lasted 10 seconds. In that silence, Garrett looked at Hannah Mercer Thornton, and for the first time he did not see a problem to be solved or an obstacle to be removed. He saw a woman who had outfought him, outthought him, and outweighted him, using his own weapons against him with more skill than he had imagined she possessed. You are making a mistake, Garrett said quietly, but the words had no weight behind them. They were reflex, the last shot from an empty gun. The only mistake made here was yours, Hannah said. 3 years ago when you looked at me and saw weakness. You were wrong then. You are wrong now. And you will stay wrong for as long as you live. She stood. Caleb stood beside her. They walked out of the parlor through the front door, across the porch with its empty rocking chairs, and mounted their horses without looking back. On the ride home, Caleb was quiet for a long time. The sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in shades of amber, and rose the kind of sunset that only comes at the end of a day when something has been settled for good. The ranch lay ahead of them, solid and real, the house and barn and fences that they had built and defended together. Smoke rose from the chimney where Levi had kept the fire going. The cattle moved slowly in the pasture. The world was quiet in the way it gets when a storm has passed, not just the weather kind, but the human kind. It is over, Caleb said. It is over, Hannah agreed. And it was. Garrett never troubled them again. The statement in the bank vault was a shield that no weapon could pierce. The truth documented and protected, waiting in the dark like a loaded gun that never needed to be fired. In the end, the most powerful man in the Stillwater Valley had not been defeated by fists or firearms, or even by a court of law. He had been defeated by a woman with a ledger book and the understanding passed down from her father that knowledge properly wielded is stronger than any amount of money. The baby came in May of 1884, and it nearly killed her. Hannah labored from dawn through midday, through the long afternoon and into the night. Caleb rode to Stillwater for Dr. Whitfield and brought the old physician back at a gallop that left both horses lathered and blowing. Whitfield worked with the steady hands of a man who had delivered 100 babies on the frontier, but even his experience could not hide the worry that settled into his face as the hours stretched on and the blood came faster than it should have. Outside, Harlan paced the porch with steps that had no rhythm. A man who had survived the Civil War but had never learned how to survive waiting. He made pot after pot of coffee because it was the only useful thing his hands could find to do. At midnight, Whitfield drew Caleb outside. The stars were bright and cold overhead, and the doctor's face was grave. "She is losing blood," Whitfield said. "I am doing everything I can, but you need to prepare yourself." Caleb stood on the porch in the dark and felt the ground tilt beneath him. He thought of Ethan, of the dust and the screaming and the silence that came after. Of 6 years talking to a hat on a bedpost because the boy who wore it was gone. If he lost Hannah now after everything, after the blizzard and Garrett and the slow, painful miracle of learning to love again, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not survive it. Not the quick death of a bullet or a fall, but the slow death of a man who has had his reason for living taken from him twice. He went back inside, knelt beside the bed, took Hannah's hand, which was slick with sweat and trembling with exhaustion. Her face was white, her eyes were half closed, but when she felt his hand close around hers, her fingers gripped back with a strength that startled him. "You are not giving up," he said. His voice shook, but every word landed like a hammer on stone. "You hear me? You rode through a blizzard to save my life. You faced down Garrett with a rifle in your hands and a baby in your belly. You are stronger than anyone I have ever known. You will get through this. You have to get through this, because I cannot lose another person I love." Hannah opened her eyes, exhausted but present, still there. She nodded once and then she fought. Through the darkest hours of the night, with Whitfield working and Caleb holding her hand and Harlan wearing a track in the porch boards outside, Hannah Thornton fought for her life and the life of her child with the same ferocity she brought to everything she did. And just before dawn, when the first pale light touched the window glass like a promise, a cry split the air, thin and raw and furious. The cry of a newborn taking his first breath. A boy, healthy, red-faced and screaming fists balled tight, already angry at the world for the indignity of being born into it. Whitfield placed the baby in Hannah's arms, and she looked down at her son with an expression that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life, wrecked and radiant at the same time. The face of a woman who had walked to the edge of death and come back carrying something miraculous. "Emmett," she whispered, the name they had chosen together after her grandfather in Connecticut. Caleb held his son for the first time and wept without shame. Harlan stood in the doorway, eyes red, maintaining with decreasing conviction that dust had gotten into them. That night, after Hannah and the baby were sleeping, Caleb opened the wooden box beneath the bed. He took out Ethan's hat, held it for a moment, then he laid it gently on the baby's chest just for a second before lifting it away. "You have a nephew, Ethan," he whispered. "I'm going to teach him everything I never got the chance to teach you. I promise." He placed the hat back in the box, closed the lid, and this time he did not open it again. The years unfolded the way years do on a working ranch, marked not by dates on a calendar, but by the rhythm of seasons and the slow accumulation of living. Clara came 2 years after Emmett, a girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Then Colton, who from the age of 4 brought home every injured bird and sick rabbit he could find, until Dr. Whitfield looked at the boy's gentle hands and told Caleb he had a veterinarian in the making. Then Nell, the youngest, who loved horses with a passion that reminded everyone who knew her of her mother at that age. The house that had been spacious for two became loud and chaotic and filled with the particular kind of joy that only children and animals can create. Caleb's leg, which had healed but always ached when the weather turned, became the source of family legend. The children begged to hear the story of the blizzard of their father limping through the snow, of their mother riding out like a hero from a storybook. The tale grew with every telling, becoming myth, becoming the foundation story of their parents' love. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing into one of the most successful operations in the valley. They hired good hands to help with the work, but Hannah never stopped being involved in every aspect of the business. Even while managing a household and raising 4 children, she found time to ride out and check fences, to sit in the barn with a sick calf through the night, to negotiate cattle prices and market with the kind of sharpness that made experienced buyers blink. Caleb loved that about her. The core of strength and independence that had first drawn him to her never softened, never diminished, never bent to any expectation of what a rancher's wife should or should not do. They had arguments, of course, as all couples do. Hannah's practicality sometimes clashed with Caleb's instinct for risk, and there were nights when they went to bed in silence, lying on opposite edges of the mattress, with the space between them feeling wider than the valley. But they never slept without resolving the quarrel, without one of them reaching across that space to find the other's hand, without remembering that they were partners in everything, that the love between them was bigger than any disagreement about cattle prices or fence lines or whether to plant alfalfa in the South Field. Harlan Dawson, growing older but no less sharp, taught Emmett to ride and to rope, passing down the same skills that the Chisholm Trail had passed to Caleb a generation before. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the four Thornton children running wild across the yard, and one evening when they were 10 years married and the worst of the hard times were behind them, he turned to Caleb with the driest expression his weathered face could manage. "You know, Thornton," Harlan said, "I told you to fix that fence before the storm. You did not listen. Storm came, cattle ran hoarse, kicked you half to death, and the neighbor girl had to ride out and save your sorry hide. Now you have got a wife, 4 children, and a ranch twice the size." He shook his head slowly. "If you had listened to me and fixed the fence, none of this would have happened." Caleb laughed. Hannah laughed. The children laughed without knowing why. On their 10th anniversary in the summer of 1893, Caleb took Hannah up to the northern ridge where she had found him that January day. It was summer now, the land green from good rains, so different from the frozen wasteland it had been that it seemed like a different country entirely. They stood looking out over the valley, over the ranch they had built together, and the 4 small figures playing near the barn below. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Tying yourself to me so fast without really knowing what you were getting into?" Hannah looked at him the way she looked at him when he said something she considered beneath his intelligence. "Caleb Thornton, 10 years ago I rode into a blizzard because I could not bear the thought of not going. 10 years later I would do it again. Every time. Every storm. Because you are the person I chose, and I have not regretted a single second of it." He kissed her on the ridgeline with the whole valley spread beneath them. And for a moment, the 28-year-old cowboy who had limped through the snow thinking he would die, and the 26-year-old woman who had ridden into that same snow without a thought for her own safety were right there beside the people they had become. Not ghosts, not memories, just the younger selves that had started it all, still present in the way they held each other. The children grew into the kind of adults that their parents had hoped for without ever daring to say it aloud. Emmett took over the ranch operations with a steady hand that combined his father's cowboy instinct with his mother's head for numbers, working alongside his parents with the same dedication they had shown. He married Sarah Beth Prescott, a rancher's daughter from the south end of the valley, and their first child, a girl named Lucy, arrived with a set of lungs that could be heard from the barn. Clara married a banker in Carson City, but came home every holiday, every branding season, every time the valley called her back, with the voice that land uses when it has claims on your blood. She never lost her love for the ranch, and her banker husband learned quickly that a woman who could rope a steer was not a woman who would be satisfied arranging flowers. Colton studied veterinary medicine back east at a school in Pennsylvania that his parents saved for 3 years to afford. He returned to Stillwater and opened a practice that became indispensable to every rancher in the valley, healing animals with the gentle hands that Dr. Whitfield had recognized when the boy was only 4 years old. Nell bred quarter horses that people came from 3 counties to buy. She had her mother's eye for stock and her father's patience with difficult animals, and by the time she was 20, horsemen across Nevada knew her name. On their 25th anniversary in 1908, the children threw a celebration that drew half the valley. There were speeches and toasts and stories that had been polished by years of telling, and through it all, Caleb held Hannah's hand and marveled at how the years had deepened the woman he loved rather than diminished her. The lines around her eyes were maps of laughter. The silver in her hair was the color of every winter they had survived together. Harlan Dawson, 82 years old now, his back bent and his hands unsteady, but his eyes still sharp as glass, stood to speak. The room went quiet. When Harlan Dawson wanted to say something, people listened because the old man had earned every word he had ever spoken. "I have lived 82 years, Harlan said, and his voice cracked, but did not waver. Walked through the Civil War, the Chisholm Trail, 3 blizzards, 2 stampedes, and a snake bite that I swear killed me before it let me live. But the most remarkable thing I ever witnessed was watching a fool cowboy get kicked half to death by his own horse. And then, from that one piece of terrible luck, build the most beautiful life I have ever seen. Here is to the both of you. The room erupted. Hannah wiped her eyes. Caleb gripped Harlan's hand, and the old man gripped back with surprising strength. That night, after the guests had gone and the children had returned to their own homes, Caleb and Hannah sat on the porch in the rocking chairs he had built years ago. Lucy, their eldest grandchild, Emmett's girl, 16, and already showing signs of becoming a formidable rancher herself, had stayed behind. "Grandma," Lucy said, sitting on the porch steps with her legs stretched out, "how did you and Grandpa keep it going so long? Half the married people I know can barely stand each other." Hannah thought before answering the way she always did when Lucy asked a question that deserved a real answer. "Because we chose each other every day," Hannah said. "Love is not something that happens once and then takes care of itself. It is a decision, every morning and every evening and every argument in between. Your grandfather is stubborn and reckless, and he has never once remembered to take off his boots before walking on my clean floor." She glanced at Caleb with a warmth that 40 years had only deepened. "But I choose him, every day, because he is good and brave and he respects me and he loves me in a way that makes me want to be better than I am." "Your grandmother is not perfect either," Caleb said. "She is bossy, and she thinks she is always right, which she usually is, and she steals the blankets every night." "You never complained about the blankets." "I loved you too much to complain." Lucy smiled. "I want to find something like what you have." "You will," Hannah said. "But remember, do not wait for it to find you. Ride out into the storm if you have to." After Lucy went to bed, Hannah turned to Caleb in the darkness. "There is something I never told you," she said. "What is that?" "I watched you for months before the blizzard. From the day you moved onto the ranch next to mine, I would see you working your land, always alone, always pushing yourself so hard. I wondered about you, wondered what your story was, wondered if you were as lonely as I was." Caleb looked at her. "When your horse came back without you," Hannah said quietly, "I was terrified, not afraid for a neighbor, afraid of losing someone I had not yet had the courage to know." Caleb raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "25 years," he said, "and you can still surprise me." Later that same year, Silas Garrett died at the age of 70. His ranch was divided among his children, none of whom had inherited their father's ambition or his ruthlessness. The shadow he had cast over the valley for decades simply dissolved like morning frost in sunlight. Hannah heard the news with quiet thought. "I am not glad he is dead," she said to Caleb, "but I am glad it is finished. My father can rest completely now." 2 years after that, in 1910, Harlan Dawson died in his sleep at the age of 84. Hannah found him in the morning peaceful, a faint smile on his face, as if death had told him one last joke, and he had appreciated the delivery. They buried him on the hill behind the ranch where he could see the whole valley, and every rancher in Stillwater came to pay respects to the old cowboy who had outlived them all. A week before the end, on a cool evening, when the first hint of autumn was in the air, Harlan had sat on the porch with Caleb one last time. The same porch, the same 2 chairs, the same view of the valley that they had shared for 27 years. Harlan's hands were unsteady now. He held his coffee cup with both of them the way a man holds something precious. His face was thinner than it had been, the leather map lines, deeper, the eyes set further back in the skull. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, the voice of a man who had one more thing to say and intended to say it right. "Caleb," Harlan said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to let me finish before you start being modest." "All right. When I first met you, you were 23 years old and carrying a dead boy's hat around like it was a piece of your own body still attached. I watched you work yourself half to death for 5 years, and I thought this one is going to dig his own grave with a fence digger and never even notice he has climbed in." Caleb said nothing. The cricket song of evening filled the silence between them. Then the blizzard came, and that woman rode out of the snow like something sent from a place I do not pretend to understand. And I watched you wake up. For the first time in 6 years, you looked at somebody and saw the future instead of the past. You looked at her and the walls came down, not all at once, but enough. enough to let the light in. Harlan's hand found Caleb's arm, and the grip, though the fingers trembled, was still strong. The best thing you ever did was not building this ranch, not beating Garrett, not raising those 4 fine children, though Lord knows that would be enough for any man. The best thing you ever did was take that hat off the bedpost and let yourself love again. That took more courage than anything I ever saw in the war. Caleb felt the tears come, and he did not fight them because Harlan was one of the few people on earth in front of whom he did not need to hold anything back. "Thank you, Harlan," he said, "for everything, for 27 years of being the closest thing I had to a father." "Do not thank me," Harlan said. "Thank the horse that kicked you." And he laughed, the dry, familiar, irreplaceable sound. The last laugh Caleb Thornton would hear from the best man he had ever ridden with. Standing at the grave a week later, Caleb spoke to Hannah beside him. "4 people," he said, "my parents, Ethan, and now Harlan, 4 people I loved most, all gone." "Not 4, Hannah said gently. "You lost 4, but how many do you have, E? 4 children, grandchildren, this ranch, and 40 years of memories with every person you lost." Caleb looked at her, the woman who had saved him from the blizzard, from Garrett, from the darkness inside his own heart. And he knew she was right, not because she was perfect, but because she saw the truth more clearly than anyone he had ever known. On a cold January morning in 1923, exactly 40 years after the blizzard that had brought them together, Caleb woke to find snow falling outside the window. Not a heavy snow, nothing like the storm that had changed their lives, just a gentle falling of white covering the ranch in silence. He was 68 years old. His hair had gone to silver. He still stood tall and straight, though some mornings the old leg made him reach for the cane that leaned against the nightstand. The leg had never fully healed. It ached every time the weather turned a private calendar that marked the passing of seasons with pain, a reminder of the day that everything changed. He looked at Hannah sleeping beside him, 66 years old, her hair completely white now, her face carrying the lines that decades of sun and wind and laughter and grief had written there. But her eyes, when she opened them, were the same color they had always been, bright, clear, seeing everything. To Caleb, she was more beautiful now than she had been at 26, not despite the years, but because of them. Every line was a year they had shared. Every strand of silver was a season they had weathered together. "I would do it all again," he whispered, not wanting to wake her, but needing to say it. "Every moment, I would choose you." Hannah opened her eyes and smiled at him with 40 years of warmth. "I know," she said. "I would choose you too." They dressed warmly and went out onto the porch to watch the snow fall. The same porch where they had sat 1,000 evenings, where the children had listened to the blizzard story until they knew it by heart, where Harlan Dawson had drunk his coffee and grumbled about the weather every morning for 27 years. The snow fell softly on the valley. No wind, no violence, just the quiet, steady falling of white, making everything clean and new. "Do you remember?" Caleb asked, knowing she would understand. "Every detail," Hannah said. "I remember being terrified that I would not find you in time. I remember seeing you limping through that snow and thinking you were the bravest fool I had ever met. I will take that as a compliment. It is the highest one I know." Caleb reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing together with the ease of 40 years of practice. Her skin was rough from a lifetime of work. His was the same. 2 pairs of hands that had built fences and branded cattle and held children and held each other through every kind of storm the world had sent their way. "You saved my cattle that day," Caleb said. "But more than that, you saved me from a half-lived life, from a loneliness I did not even know I was carrying. You gave me a reason to put the hat away and look forward instead of back." "We saved each other," Hannah said gently. "That is what love does." They went inside together, hand in hand the way they had walked for 40 years. At the breakfast table, Caleb reached across and took Hannah's hand again. She squeezed his fingers in return, a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious, but which carried the full weight of everything they had been to each other. On the high shelf above the kitchen window, the morning light touched a small wooden box. Inside it, folded carefully, lay a sun-faded cowboy hat with a curled brim, the hat of an 18-year-old boy who had dreamed of building a ranch in Nevada. It was not on the bedpost anymore. It had not been there for decades, but it was still in the house. still part of the family. Not a ghost holding a man in his past, but a memory kept safe by someone who had learned with the help of a woman who rode through a blizzard that it is possible to honor the dead and still choose to live. Outside, the snow fell gently on the Stillwater Valley, on the pastures where cattle grazed descendants of the herd that Caleb had nearly lost 40 years before, on the barn where horses stamped and breathed descendants of the mare that had carried Hannah through the storm, on the house that two people had filled with children and noise and love, built on a foundation that began with one terrible day and one me and brave decision. Hannah hummed softly as she poured the coffee, a tune Caleb did not recognize, but loved the way he loved everything about her completely and without reservation. He watched her the way he had watched her every morning for 40 years, and knew that of all the decisions he had ever made in his life, loving her was the finest. The story that began with a cowboy limping through the snow and a woman riding out to help him had become something enduring, a testament to the power of love to transform and sustain, to heal what seemed beyond healing, to build from wreckage, something that would outlast them both. Their children carried it forward. Their grandchildren would carry it further. And somewhere in the telling and retelling of how it all began, the truth would always remain the same. That sometimes the best thing in your life starts on the worst day. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to ride into the storm anyway. And that two people, if they choose each other every single day, can build something that no blizzard, no villain, and no amount of time can ever tear apart. The snow kept falling, the coffee was warm, and Caleb Thornton sat across from the woman who had saved his life 40 years ago, held her hand, and was grateful.